Hi class. For this video, we're going to be looking at the African coast and the Portuguese. To begin looking at this, we're going to first look at why the Portuguese wanted to explore the African coast. So first of all, the Portuguese were cut off from the Mediterranean and the Italian city-state trade that was taking place. Because of this, they wanted to better be able to expand into trade networks and thought that traveling around Africa would be helpful. The Portuguese benefited from the leadership of Prince Henry the Navigator. He launched explorations of the African coast in the 1420s. He wanted to find a passage to India via the Atlantic Ocean. Remember, at this time, and thinking back to earlier weeks, Europeans hadn't quite mapped out Africa yet, and they didn't understand how large and expansive it was. In order to settle into Africa, he invented and gathered information from astronomers, geographers, map makers, and craftsmen in the Arab world, and Italian cartographers and navigators. In doing so, he wanted to invest in his country by being able to expand into trade networks. He also invested in shipbuilding, and his colleagues created the carvel. These vessels were narrow hulls and triangular sails that were especially effective for navigating the west coast of Africa. This allowed them to trade gold, ivory, and later slaves from West Africa. Up here I also have Elmina Castle, but we're going to talk about that more specifically in just a couple of. For a time after Prince Henry's death, the Portuguese began to lose interest in advancing further along the African coast. In 1469, however, the king awarded the African trading post rights to Fernando Gomez. He was required to further explore the African coastline. As a result of his voyages, by the mid-1470s, the Portuguese had explored the entire Guinea coast. The opening of the Guinea coast was very important to Portugal. The Portuguese had now begun to outflank Arab and Ottoman traders and the Muslim world. In 1479, the Crown refused to renew Gomez's contract so it could directly monopolize trade with Africa for itself. Over the next few decades, the Portuguese on the Gold Coast would divert a third to one-half of gold dust from the caravan trade. Pepper, ivory, and especially slaves also made money for the king and Portuguese merchants. In the second half of the 15th century, the Portuguese purchased more than 100,000 Africans. Prior to the discovery of the Americas, the Atlantic slave trade was beginning to compete with the Islamic world slave trade. Portuguese captains also profited from carrying merchandise and slaves from one African coast to another. The monarchy kept for itself a monopoly on the importing of gold, slaves, ivory, and pepper. The diversion of gold to the coast most likely weakened the first Songhai Empire. This polity stood at the crossroads of trade between the forest and the desert. We talked about this earlier in the class. Less gold meant less foreign exchange to buy imports from. The discovery and settlement of the islands in the Gulf of Guinea permitted the Portuguese to expand the Madeira model of commerce agriculture. The plantation complex was transferred to these islands and proved to be very successful. With this plantation complex, which we will talk about more in a couple of weeks, you see that Europeans are able to dominate the land by creating a cash crop, something like sugar, and they are able to then transport it to other areas. However, in order to do so, they have to have a large labor force, and in this case, you see African slaves being used. The plantation complex was transferred to these islands and proved to be very successful. By the beginning of the 16th century, São Tomé replaced Madeira as Europe's greatest sugar supplier. In 1417, on the conclusion of Gomez's contract, the trading concessions for the islands and the African coast were awarded to the Crown Prince João II in 1481. He was very interested in Africa. His first move was to construct a fort, or a trading factory, on the Gold Coast. San Jose de Mina, later referred to simply as Elmina Castle, was created. This fort was designed not simply to funnel the gold trade to the Portuguese, but also to monopolize and defend Portuguese traders against Castilian and other European interlopers. The construction of the castle meant the ships no longer had to wait offshore for weeks or months waiting for African traders to meet them. Previously, since Europeans were susceptible to disease and attack from Africans, they had to wait for Africans to come to them while they stayed in their ships. With this fort, however, you can see they no longer have to wait. Although the local ruler on this coast preferred the existing arrangement with what he called the, quote, ragged and ill-dressed men, end quote, he agreed after some bargaining to the building and the operation of the castle. The way he saw it, he and his people could benefit from this trade as well. Now we're going to look specifically at the Portuguese in the Congo, the situation in the Canaries, and what happens in Angola. So for your assessment for this week, you'll see you're asked to give an example. Any of these three would work well as an example. So starting with the Portuguese in the Congo. During the years when the South Atlantic was opened, the Portuguese established themselves along the coast of Africa. This was a trading empire modeled on the Venetians in the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Small enclaves of traders and officials dotted the coast. So essentially what you see happening is that in Africa, I'm just going to pull up a map here, they're going to try and create forts, again, along the African coast and on some of these islands. The idea is that they can trade back and forth between these ports and then take that trade back to Portugal. The Portuguese generally did not impose themselves upon Africans. Rather, they inserted themselves into existing trading networks and political relationships. I want you to keep this particular phrase in mind. It's important to understand and to rework our minds to realize that the Portuguese did not simply go into Africa and take control of various areas. Rather, they had to work very meticulously to create relationships with African kingdoms and governments, and they had to sort of tap into already existing trade networks. This is something we will see later on when we start to look at the Americas. So getting back to this week's information, in 1486, King Bemoim, the ruler of the Wolof Kingdom in Senegal, petitioned the Portuguese for assistance with a succession dispute. João agreed to help for the conversion of Bemoim to Christianity and the friendly reception of missionaries. So in this example, you can see that in Africa, the kings were willing to ask for Portuguese help, but the Portuguese wanted something in return. Now let's turn to the Congo. At the invitation of the African king, the Portuguese became involved in the Kingdom of Congo. The Portuguese sent missionaries, craftsmen, masons, and farmers to teach the Congolese European ways. At the Congo capital, they began to build a stone town called San Salvador. In 1491, King Ningo Nukuwu was baptized King João, and several Congo noblemen followed his example. The Portuguese king saw him as an ally and a brother in arms. African princes and nobles from various kingdoms were welcomed at court in Lisbon, and ambassadors were exchanged whenever possible. It would seem both the Portuguese and Africans welcomed closer relations and ties of friendship. In Senegal and the Congo, and many points in between, Portuguese officials and merchants traded with African rulers and merchants. So again, a more mutually beneficial relationship. The Portuguese generally had to negotiate treaties with the local ruler and pay some of the tribute to do business. The power of African states, as well as the deadliness of African diseases, kept Europeans away from the interior and on the coast and the islands in the Gulf of Guinea. In 1506, Mbenza Ngeya, I'm sorry for my pronunciations, was Christianized Afonso I. He seized the throne with the Portuguese assistance and against anti-Portuguese factions that had been created. He was a sincere Christian and believed in the Portuguese experiment of Europeanizing an African state. He ordered the lord of his provinces that anyone who had idols contrary to the Christian religion should have them burned. He also requested Jesuit missionaries. They established a European-style royal court, wore Portuguese dress, created a Portuguese table of silver and gold plates and utensils, built a Portuguese-style throne, distributed titles of nobility, attempted to implement elements of Portuguese law, and attempted to undermine the Congo cult of royal graves. again, in this you can see that the Congo, more specifically than other areas, was willing to become more European. The alliance and friendship desired by the Portuguese monarchy was steadily undermined, however, by the slave trade directed from São Tomé and for the plantations of São Tomé. Portuguese profiteers and slave trade agents conducted business throughout the area. These subordinate chiefs, who increasingly became more independent, however, were beginning to be upset by the trade. By the 1520s, the slave trade had begun to depopulate areas of the kingdom and created slave revolts and political turmoil. One of the primary sources for this leak is going to delve further into a letter sent by Afonso to the Portuguese king. In this letter, he pleads for them to stop interacting in the slave trade and to stop selling his people. The Portuguese, however, ignored this plea, and he sought to take matters into his own hands. In 1526, for example, he established a commission to ensure that slaves exported into slavery were true war captives and not free men. This attempt was resented by traders. However, Christianity had helped to strengthen his kingdom and power. By 1540, he even had a surplus of war criminals and war captives, and because of this, he was not as restrictive on the trade, though the law was still in place. When he died in 1543, there was a violent succession crisis between Afonso and his son Pedro and his nephew Diego. Pedro came to war with Diego and won with the help of the Portuguese. Africans and the Portuguese, who disagreed with the previous policies put in place by Afonso, revolted successfully and placed Diego in power not long after Pedro had taken over. Under Diego and his successors, the Portuguese experiment in the Congo further unraveled. The kingdom will become fragmented and isolated from Portuguese culture and from Christianity. Another thing that's important to remember about the Congo at this time is that many of the slaves who were taken are going to be captives of war. This is important because many of these captives are going to go to places in the New World once it is established. In a couple of weeks, or towards the end of the semester, when we begin to look at Haiti and the Haitian Revolution, we will see that in Saint-Domingue, which is later Haiti, many of the slaves actually come from the Congo due to these wars that take place. The Portuguese slave trade exacerbates these wars, and more people become involved in the wars. Because of this, we will see that a lot of these Congolese slaves are going to not only be Christian, but they are also going to be very well trained in the art of war, which we will talk about more later. The next area we're going to look at are the Canary Islands. The European colony in the Atlantic, the first one was the Canary Island Archipelago. The Canaries were populated by native people, sometimes collectively referred to as Guanches, but the book argues that they should be simply referred to as native Canarias. In 1402, the Franco-Norman Knights began the conquest and colonization of two of the least populated islands in the Canaries. With Castilian assistance, the two knights brought Castilian and Norman settlers to their islands. In 1424, Prince Henry dispatched a force of several thousand mounted and unmounted crusaders to conquer Gran Carina. I'm going to try and point that out on the map right here. To convert the people. This was a military disaster. However, Henry really wanted to be involved in the Canaries, and 10 years later, he sent a fleet to another island, this one right here, sort of the big one out here, and he had around 400 captives seized, but he was also still unable to break native resistance. Later, they tried to use a sort of strategy of divide and conquer by going in and trying to make alliances with various native groups who already had enemies and trying to take control that way. However, by 1446, both islands remained under native control. In 1448, Henry undertook a new type of effort to control the Canaries. He brought the feudal rights of lordship from the two men that we talked about previously, and he wanted to establish a new Portuguese administration. In 1450, however, within a year of the new arrangement, natives had successfully expelled the Portuguese officials and colonists who had come in order to basically plan out Henry's wishes. The following year, Henry sent a fleet of 5 caravels carrying 300 men at arms to retake the area. The expedition, however, failed because the settlers and native people of the Canaries were able to again resist the Portuguese. It's important to remember that the conquest, and that's normally put in quotes, I think, in your book, of the native peoples of the Canary Islands, a people of Stone Age technology, lasted more than a century. During this time, conquistadors found Canarians to be formidable enemies and achieved more success and pacification through alliances and negotiation than through power and terror. However, keep in mind that with the Canary Islands, the people do suffer greatly. Many of them are killed, enslaved, and carried away. The final section we're going to look at for today is going to be looking at the Portuguese in Angola. 2 years after the King of Congo had been restored to his throne by military expedition, Portugal prepared for a second military conquest. In 1571, the monarchy was awarded Paulo Dias. This was the territorial proprietorship of Angola. As the proprietor, Diaz was given the responsibility to settle and defend Angola on behalf of the crown. He was awarded the governorship of Angola for his lifetime. In short, for the first time in Africa, the Portuguese had authorized the conquest and colonization of an African kingdom. When Diaz arrived on the coast of Angola, he found a Portuguese population of around 50 men. He founded the city of São Paulo, later called Luanda, on the mainland with a company of around 400 Portuguese soldiers and craftsmen. They later began to advance and build more ports. Although Diaz was successful in bringing some local chiefs under Portuguese control and thus African warriors into his army, he was never able to defeat the Nagola. In fact, in several battles, the Portuguese were forced to reroute. Thousands of African bowmen proved to be superior to dozens of Portuguese musketeers. During this decade of conflict, something like 2,000 Portuguese were killed in battle or by disease. In 1591, the Spanish Habsburgs rescinded the donation charter, which allowed the Portuguese to have Angola in the first place, and established their own royal colony. The new governor arrived with 400 soldiers and 50 cavalry. They acquired some 15,000 African soldiers, but this renewed conquest was only slightly more successful than the first. A third attempt of conquest began in 1602. This force saw the region where silver, and they believed it could be silver, so they were going to try and go into that area, but further expeditions proved that no silver was there, and the conquest of Angola at this point had yielded no more than a small chain of forts. In the end, the conquest of Angola had won the Portuguese very little. War disrupted peaceful slave trading in convoys and simply reduced the numbers of captives that were dispatched to Luanda. So this conquest was not really successful for either the Portuguese or for the people of Angola. So hopefully that helps to give you a couple of different examples of how the Portuguese were able to go into Africa, and hopefully you can see from there that there were a lot of disputes and issues that the Portuguese encountered. It wasn't that they were always successful, and in fact many times had to tap into existing trade networks and form alliances rather than using their power and might, because that didn't always work. For this week's assignments, just to talk about those a little bit, the first one that you have is going to look at African kingdoms and the Portuguese. So some of you are going to be looking at trade and politics in the Congo. So the first one is going to be a letter basically from King Afonso. This is his name before it is Christianized. He presents a letter to the Portuguese king talking about the slave trade. So you're going to be analyzing that particular letter. The next source is going to be looking at a Portuguese expedition, and that's going to be looking at the idea of resistance. So kind of what we talked about with Angola just now. So you'll be looking at that. However, I don't think it's looking at Angola, but it's a similar idea. So you'll be analyzing the way the Portuguese and Africans viewed one another, the way the Portuguese understood the people of Gambia, and how the Gambian viewed the Portuguese. So we'll be looking at that for this week. Remember to always respond to someone who has the opposite source from you. That's a very important thing. And make sure that you really focus in on those analysis questions for this week. In addition to that, for this week, you will also have your assessment like normal. And with this assessment, you will be using the book, PowerPoint, or this lecture, whatever you would like to use. As far as the short answers, the first one is going to come from the first few pages of the reading this week, pages 81 through 83. You're going to be looking at how the Portuguese became rich on the coast of Africa. Very generally, how were they able to do this? It looks at very early on what was taking place. We've already talked about it, but this is going to include different things like gold, slavery, ivory, and so on. But there's more explained in the book with that. The next question wants you to look at the relationship between African kingdoms and the Portuguese. This is a more general question. How did they enter into and form alliances? What role did religion have in these relationships? And then to give at least one example from the reading or lecture. So any of the three that I just talked about, plus there are several more in the reading for this week. The next one asks you to look at the Canary Islands, then the Congo, and then Angola. So the ones that we just talked about, there's a matching section like normal and a couple of multiple choice questions put throughout. So hopefully you now have a better understanding of the African coast and the Portuguese. Remember, you have those three examples that you can use on your assessment, and if you have any questions about any of this, a lot of it could be explained through your reading for this week, but you can always feel free to reach out and let me know any questions you might have. I am always happy to help. Thank you and have a great day.